Real Food for Fertility is your ultimate guide to optimizing your nutritional stores before pregnancy. In Real Food for Fertility, my co-author Lily Nichols and I argue that a healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for optimal fertility and a healthy pregnancy. You can read the first chapter for free over at realfoodforfertility.com. And did you know that you can listen to Real Food for Fertility for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/realfood, one word, for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/realfood. Now let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 556. In today's FAMM research series, I am diving into an interesting question. The title of today's episode is Overcoming Your Luteal Phase Carb Cravings. This is something that many of us have experienced where we're going into the week before a period. So period's coming soon, and here we are craving all these carbs, craving chocolate. And so I found a research paper that looked at this scientifically so that we can gain some insight into what the research is actually saying about this. Is this just an anecdotal experience that, so many of us have had? And of course, not every single woman necessarily would report experiencing this the same way. But either way, it's a very interesting question, and I'm excited to delve into what the research has to say about it in today's episode. So I always say that the title of these episodes leaves something to be desired. The title is Changes in Micronutrient and Food Group Intakes Throughout the Menstrual Cycle in Healthy Premenopausal Women. So kind of a mouthful, but essentially the researchers are looking specifically at how these women are eating across the menstrual cycle. And so I do find that there are some very interesting takeaways overall. And I guess the overall thought that I want to share right here at the top is that there is truth to this. It's not something, I think we all know this. I think if you are a menstruating woman or you've had a period before and you've had this experience, I think that it is helpful to know right off the bat that there is truth to this whole craving thing. But I think when we dive into the results, it does provide a little bit more nuance and background basis that can help us in terms of how we're going to organize our months so that we don't end up totally binging on all the sugar and all the stuff towards the end of that time. So the researchers decided to look specifically at this question because we know anecdotally that so many women experience changes in appetite and cravings. It's one of those things, almost comical, that, it's that time of the month, right? So that's one of the reasons why they're looking at it. But I do really appreciate when we are diving into some of these topics in a more nuanced, specific way so that we can really gain a little bit more objective data on how much. When we say that there's an increased appetite or increased cravings, how much does it really change? What does this really look like? And so not only did the study look at the change in the amount of food overall that women were consuming, they broke it down by macronutrient category, and they even broke it down somewhat into micronutrients, looking at if there's an increase or difference in the consumption of specific nutrients throughout the menstrual cycle, as well as the overall macronutrient intake. If there's a change or difference in the amount of protein, fat, and carbohydrates specifically that women are consuming. But what they also did is they also looked at cravings to see if there was a change in the cravings that were reported across the cycle. So again, I think that this research study hit on a number of points that provide us with an interesting insight into what's really going on here. In order to gather this data, the study group was about 259 healthy women of reproductive age who were having regular menstrual cycles. They did questionnaires with these women, having them to note down what they were consuming. And from that data, they were able to extrapolate the amount of food they were eating and do that comparison. In order to identify where they were in their cycle, they did use fertility monitors to measure urinary metabolites so that they could determine around when ovulation was taking place so that they could more accurately identify where these women were in the menstrual cycle. They did note, of course, that when they're tracking that there was a percentage of the participants who noted an anovulatory cycle, but they did define that based on the urinary metabolites. So if the women were doing the urine testing at a certain time and the progesterone didn't reach a certain level, then they would identify that as an anovulatory cycle. Now, of course, as someone with a background in fertility awareness charting, whenever I look at these studies, I always think to myself, oh, it'd be so great if they, have them chart and do all this extra work. In order to gather this type of research, they do have to collect the data in a way that is kind of most convenient and conducive to actually get the study done. So it's not something that's always going to be exactly how we want it as, fertility awareness nerds wanting all this data and information. Because again, when I hear it was an ovulatory cycle, I often think to myself, well, is it just that there was a delayed ovulation and the study didn't necessarily lend itself to being able to test at the right time? So that's just putting that information out there. But it is always interesting to see how they define these types of things. Because of course, if you're thinking about the cycle on a 28-day interval and you have 259 women that you're testing, not all of them are going to ovulate within whatever period of time that you think that they are. And it does make for a complexity in a study because you wouldn't necessarily be able to account for that small percentage of women who are going to have that delayed ovulation or potentially have levels of hormones that are not necessarily detectable on that particular day for that particular thing. So that was just an aside. I just thought I would put that out there. But overall, I do think that the study design was solid. And I think that they did have a good and consistent way of identifying around where these women were in the cycle so that they could gather some really accurate data around how the food consumption and cravings were changing throughout the menstrual cycle. So unsurprisingly, the researchers did find that there was a change in energy intake, particularly protein and fat intake around the mid-luteal phase specifically. So during that time in question, that week or so before the period actually starts, they did find that there was a significant increase in protein intake, animal protein intake specifically. And this coincided actually with an increase in zinc intake because primarily, typically our food sources of zinc would be animal protein. So interestingly, they did find that during that mid-luteal, we were eating more animal protein, in particular protein overall, animal protein specifically, and that lent itself to eating statistically significantly more zinc as well during that time because of that correlation. So when compared to the follicular phase around ovulation, they did find that there were lower intakes of animal protein and protein overall compared to the intakes specifically during that mid-luteal phase. And when they tested for appetite and cravings, so specifically cravings for chocolate, sweets, salty flavored foods, and other food cravings, they found that women reported higher food cravings during that mid-luteal phase compared to the other parts of their cycle. So the way that the researchers explained this shift, of course, in appetite as well as shift in protein intake in particular, was that the hypothesis behind this is that progesterone may stimulate the appetite while estrogen may suppress the appetite. Either way, what they're saying is that there is a hormonal influence on these changes. And so due to the influx of progesterone during that post-ovulatory luteal phase, in that mid-luteal period of time, that there is this impact hormonally that is causing us to eat more. Now, what's interesting about this is I wouldn't want you to take this data as I've talked about it so far, so to this other level to think that women are just consuming so much more food during this time to the point of ridiculousness, because that's not what the data showed either. I mean, when they're looking at statistical significance, they're looking at an impact that is consistent, showing that statistical level of significance. But it doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that these women were doubling their protein intake or tripling it or eating thousands more calories during this time. That's not what it shows at all. When we look at the actual data and they print it out, that they have the data shown, they have a variety of different tables when they're showing the comparison between the protein intake during the menstrual phase, follicular phase, luteal phase, And what they found, I mean, in this table here, they're showing that the animal protein that was consumed in the mid-luteal phase was an average of 43 grams per day versus 40. Again, the average 40-ish during that follicular phase and menstrual phase. And similarly, overall protein intake was an average of 65 grams per day during the mid-luteal compared to like 61, 62 in that follicular phase. So this is something that I wanted to touch on a little bit because the research is showing us that there's definitely a statistically significant increase in protein intake, but it doesn't mean that these women are going out and just eating so much more food. There's a subtle but significant increase in their overall intake during this time. And so I think that this is, again, why the research can really help us to look more deeply at these topics. And instead of just kind of talking kind of out the side of our face, like, oh, it's luteal, so I'm just going to go and like load up on ice cream. Like it shows us that really and truly, these women were just kind of living their natural lives and kind of reporting what they were reporting. And there was an increase, but again, it was not what you might think. And hopefully that helps. I would imagine that for some of you, as I was talking initially, like, oh, there's this word statistically significant increase. It must mean, right, that they're just, eating so much. But then the quantity of it, when we actually look at the data, is potentially less than we might have thought. Now, this is an average. So, of course, there would have been some participants that did consume significantly more or less. Overall, there was a couple things that I just wanted to highlight. One thing that I thought was interesting that just may not be related at all, but when we look at the menstrual cycle, when we look at period pain, a pretty decent percentage of women do experience some level of period pain. And we know that zinc is a potent anti-inflammatory. So I did find it to be just of note that they didn't find a lot of associations with micronutrients specifically. So they were measuring a variety of different vitamins and a variety of different micronutrients, minerals. But the only really significant increase or change that they found was in the zinc consumption. So they did note that there was a statistically significant increase in the amount of zinc consumed in the mid-luteal, but they didn't really find that association with other micronutrients. So I don't know if it's related or not, but I did think about that because zinc is a potent anti-inflammatory. There's a number of research studies that have shown that it has a positive impact on period pain. It can reduce some of that inflammation and reduce some of those symptoms. And I'm not saying that the amount that they consumed is enough to make this significant difference, but it was the one nutrient that was noted they did find that women were consuming more during that time, and that corresponded to the increase in protein. And again, in this study, they did kind of single out that they did note the increase in animal protein, specifically protein overall, and they compared it to a variety of other macronutrients. And there was not that statistically significant increase for the majority of the other nutrients of note. So, for example, they did not find a significant increase in carbohydrate consumption in this particular study. It was limited to protein, essentially. You thought it would be easy. Teach them to chart their menstrual cycles, they said. Help them learn to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, they said. And then you saw the charts. You saw things that you didn't even know were possible, and you really don't know how to interpret them. Fortunately, I've created the perfect solution for you. I want to share with you our top resource for women's health professionals, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you. This new resource breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. It will give you the tools you need to better support your clients. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. They also didn't find a statistically significant increase in fat intake based on the luteal phase only. In this particular study, it was limited to the protein intake. So then the question, that I posed at the beginning of the cycle, how does this affect us, and how could this help us to manage some of these cravings during the luteal phase? I think that it is worth noting that the average protein intake, from what I have observed working with women over the years, especially women who are struggling with hormone balance, wanting to improve progesterone levels, wanting to reduce PMS symptoms, is that many women inadvertently undereat protein. So this kind of result of the average intake of protein daily falling somewhere between 60 and 65 grams does not surprise me at all. And it does fall a bit lower, I think, than what it should. So in terms of managing some of those carb cravings around the luteal phase, I think if you're wanting to manage cravings at all, I mean, I always say I'm a recovering sugarholic. When I was in high school, when I was a youngster, sugar was like a food group and I would eat a lot of gummy candies. So I've since, recovered from this lifetime in my young years of eating all the sugar. But I can tell you a couple of things that helped me. And I did a whole episode on this sugar thing a couple of years ago. So I'll be sure to link that in case you're wanting to take a deep dive into Lisa's sugarholic background and how I sorted that out. But there's a couple things that are useful if you're struggling with cravings to consider. One of them is, of course, blood sugar balance. When you are consuming breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a scenario that's really carb heavy and you're not balancing that out with protein and fat, then that is a recipe for more cravings. When you are not, basically, said another way, you're also hungry. Because when you're eating, let's say, a carbohydrate heavy meal, you're not necessarily getting yourself satiated. You're not necessarily getting enough protein and fat to really fill that hunger void over the long term. So kind of like the difference between the slow burn and the fast burn. If you are building a fire and you just put a ton of newspaper on there, that would be the carbohydrates in that metaphor, then it's going to burn fast, you get some energy, get a really big fire, really satisfying, but it doesn't last very long because once it's burned, it's burned. But if you were to get some like good significant pieces of wood or some coal or something like that, then you get this slower burn that the fire isn't necessarily as exciting, but it does last longer and you have that warmth and heat for a longer period of time. And in that scenario, that coal and that larger pieces of wood would be more of the protein and fat in that slow burn scenario. So organizing your meals, making sure that each meal and snack has a combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrates goes a long, long, long way in terms of ensuring that you are satiated and satisfied. When you actually eat enough food, then the chocolate and the sweets become a true snack instead of what you're doing because you're hungry and you didn't realize. If you're eating the whole chocolate bar, the whole, tub of ice cream or whatever, you're likely just hungry and you're not necessarily eating enough, like overall. Like you just need to eat enough food so that you are satiated, and then the snacks can be truly a snack. So if anything, this natural tendency to consume more protein, specifically during the luteal phase, is your body's way of telling you that you likely need to prioritize that protein to stabilize blood sugar. And I think that we can take that as a hint, like your body's giving you a hint. You're wanting more during that time. And so I think that we can take that information and apply it. And it doesn't have to mean that, oh, well, this study proves that, we have higher cravings during this time. So I have to eat all this chocolate. No, you don't. You can actually make a decision as to how you're going to manage that time. And there have been some hypotheses that maybe this natural kind of craving for chocolate is maybe this natural desire to consume more magnesium-rich foods. Again, maybe it's your body's way of combating some of that natural inflammation that happens at the time. Now, this is just not in the study. This is me sharing a hypothesis just to make us think. And if I do find some research on that potential tendency, I'll certainly share it with you. But it is useful to think about it. So I think that what this study tells us is that there's definitely truth to it. It's not in our head. Our menstrual cycle is associated with cravings at certain times. As we know that it is very common. And again, not everybody experiences predominantly the carb cravings. There are different types of PMS. I talk about this in the fifth vital sign. I have a whole chapter on PMS and the different types of PMS, one of which the subtypes is the carb cravings. Another is anxiety, depression. Anxiety is one, depression is another, and hypohydration or bloating is another. So there's 4 main types of PMS. And it's not to say that the carb cravings is one that everyone experiences. Some women more predominantly experience some of the other types, but many experience a combination of the main 4 types. So that is useful. But again, it does show the credence to this. There is some truth to this. But the way that I look at it as well is that when our hormones are out of balance, that is what is associated and correlated with higher rates of these PMS symptoms. So it's when your hormones are out of balance that you're more likely to experience those carb cravings or that anxiety or the depression or the hypohydration and bloating. And when we're able to balance our hormones overall, the amount of PMS that we experience goes down, including the cravings. So making sure that you are prioritizing, sufficient protein, fat, and carbohydrates at each meal is a huge step in the right direction. And if you are looking for more information and specifically more data on why that is effective, I would highly recommend to grab a copy of Real Food for Fertility if you haven't. So my newest book, co-authored with Lily Nichols, that we released last year, Valentine's Day. So if you haven't grabbed your copy of that, I highly recommend that you do so. We outline in great detail, especially in the earlier chapters of the book, chapters 2, 3, 4, the nutritional foundations that you need in order to keep your blood sugar balanced and ensure that you are not racing to the chocolate bars or whatever it is, tongue in cheek, pardon my little joke, when you are in your luteal phase. So even if you're not actively trying to conceive, Real Food for Fertility was designed to support you to achieve optimal menstrual cycle health. Because of course, our view on this topic is that a healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for optimal fertility. And so even if you're not trying to conceive, you still likely want that optimal, healthy menstrual cycle, that foundation. You can grab a copy of the first chapter for free over at realfoodforfertility.com. And you can grab the book in paperback, ebook, and audiobook versions over at Amazon. The link, if you're wanting to grab the audiobook, fertilityfriday.com/realfood. So you can check that out, fertilityfriday.com/realfood. So with that said, I want to wrap here. If you enjoyed today's episode and you can think of someone who would benefit from hearing it, the share link is fertilityfriday.com/556. And with that said, I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving our FAMM research series, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness in your practice, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool with your clients. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMWL to join the waiting list and be the first to know when registration opens up again. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL. There is no program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL.